I always think that the actual recording's the gold because so many more people watch it after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to go back to my share. Okay, we go. Harry, stop it.
Mm.
1 second, Sally. I have got my screen is stuck on Acrobat. So. I'll admit people in 2 minutes. I'm just getting my slide deck back. It closed.
Hmm.
Okay, I'm not going to show my slide deck because I can't, which is fine. So I'm just going to go with introducing myself and Alice Austen and then introducing you, keeping it more simple. Please go see. She's just arrived home right now, so I'll admit everyone in 1 minute. Come on, let's go see. Go find Donna. Quickly. Quickly. Come on, Harry. Come on, because I got to shut you guys out. Come on. Treats. Come on, treats. Over here. Oh, she's getting Out. No, oh, no. Come on. Go see Anna. I'm just going to shut my door, Anna. Anna, my virtual program's on. I'm live, if you guys could just try. Okay, here we go. I'm going to admit all. Welcome everyone that's just joined us this evening. I'm just going to give one more minute for others to join and then we will start tonight's program. So welcome to the Alice Austen House edition of Voices and Votes, our scholar lecture series. Voices and Votes is a wonderful Smithsonian exhibition that has partnered with the Museum Association of New York and Museum on Main Street to bring a wonderful exhibition about the history of democracy in America to small towns in the New York region. And so it's a traveling exhibition, and the Alice Austen House has it for 6 weeks currently. And a part of this series, we have a response exhibition at our museum. My name's Victoria Munro, and I am the executive director of the Alice Austen House. The Alice Austen House is a historic house located on the waterfront of Staten Island in New York City. And we really kind of embody that small town feel on Staten Island, which is why we are the lucky recipients of the exhibition Voices and Votes. The Alice Austen House, the original structure was built in 1690, but it is named after its most famous and wonderful resident, Alice Austen, who was born in 1866 and lived until 1952. Alice is famed for her photographs. She left us a legacy of over 8,000 images of a changing New York City. And she was an incredible woman, a real trailblazer, not just in the fields of photography and street photography. She also formed so many different social clubs and was incredibly important to the social network of and fabric of Staten Island. She was the founding member of the Staten Island Garden Club, the Staten Island Bicycle Club. She had cooking clubs and so many spaces that were reserved for women only. And so she really operated within what was acceptable activities for Victorian women to do without male chaperones. And so she essentially created safe space for her and her woman friends. Alice was also a lesbian who spent 55 years in a loving relationship with her partner, Gertrude Tate. And so we have the honor of being a nationally designated landmark of LGBTQ history. Essentially, we are an art museum focusing primarily on photography. We tell the life and the story of Alice Austen in our permanent exhibits, but we're also a platform for contemporary art with 3 art galleries and outdoor exhibitions in a 15-acre park. And a part of that mandate is that we regularly meet with scholars to really ground ourselves in the period that Austen was alive and also provide fresh storytelling opportunities that really enrich our understanding of Austen and how we relate to the site, the house, and her narrative. Every day and in over 40 public programs per year. tonight I am so thrilled to welcome Dr. Sally Wagner, and it is just an honor to have you here. And I want to introduce Sally in a more formal way, just to ground our talk tonight, and to let you know that we will be taking questions and answers in the chat, which I will shepherd at the end of Dr. Wagner's talk. So at any stage during the talk, I welcome you to post those questions, and I'll be monitoring that. So without further ado, I just want to say, yes, thank you so much, Dr. Wagner. Dr. Wagner is one of the most prominent historians of the suffrage movement, awarded one of the first doctorates in the country for work in women's studies at UC Santa Cruz, and the founder of the one of the first college level women's studies programs in the United States at CSU Sacramento. Dr. Wagner has taught women's studies courses for 53 years, currently at the Syracuse University Honors Program, and she is the founding director of the Matilda Joslyn Gage Foundation. Dr. Wagner has appeared on CNN, several PBS documentaries, and BBC, among others. Also quoted in the New York Times, Washington Post, Nation, and Time magazines, her articles have appeared in Ms. Magazine, USA Today, and Northeast Indian Quarterly. Her books include The Women's Suffrage Movement, published by Penguin Classics, Sisters in Spirit. I am so sorry, Dr. Wagner, you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation of this. You can all hear that I have an accent. I'm from New Zealand, and I do not like pronouncing words wrong. How do I say this word?
Haudenosaunee.
Thank you. The influence on women's rights, Native Voices Press, and We Want Equal Rights, how suffragists were influenced by the Native American woman, 7th generation. Listen, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us tonight. I am going to remove my pin and let you have the floor. Like I say, please post your questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring it, and welcome to you all tonight.
Well, thank you, Victoria. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I will begin my story in 1866 when Alice Austen was born. And she seems an incredibly amazing woman, and I hope someday to visit your museum physically. And I really recommend people to go on the website and see the slide deck that you've done of the exhibit that you're currently doing. I'm coming to you from Onondaga Territory, the center of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I'm in Syracuse, New York, and I'm 20 minutes away from the Onondaga Nation. Um, Talking tonight, I'm really going to focus on, let me just show you quickly, two of my books, Time of Protest, and it's the Suffragists Challenge the Republic. Um, I think that's part of the creation of um, democracy in this country, is the exhibit that you're currently showing will attest. And the women's suffrage movement, the foreword by Gloria Steinem. This is the first intersectional anthology of the women's suffrage movement. So if you want the longer picture, those two books will give it to you, but I'll give you the shorthand version tonight. 1866, the Civil War ended. The women are in a very strong position. They had been met, they'd been meeting with the exception of 1 year through the 1850s, the National First Convention was in 1850, and until the Civil War broke out, they met yearly. And so the movement was really in a strong place 10 years later. But the war broke out, and the women said, we'll put aside our work and we'll support the war effort. And how they did that is interesting. They gathered the largest number of signatures that had been gathered in the country to that point. And what were they supporting? Well, it was at a time when Lincoln was saying the war was being fought to preserve the Union. And they said, no, we are supporting the war effort to end slavery. And they gathered the signatures. They also, the women in the country were really responsible for the health care, um, the treatment of the injured during the Civil War because they raised money for the through the Sanitary Commission. They raised money to support all the hospital work that was being done in the field. So they are in a strong position politically. You know, they've showed their political muscle. The war ends and they say, you know what? We're going to start our work, but we're going to restart it in a different way because we're going to reach out to the anti-slavery organization that, you know, we've been working parallel with them through the 1850s. And the suffragists were supporting the abolition movement, and the abolitionists were supporting the women's rights movement. They held their conferences pretty close together so they could go to both. So they said, look, this is the moment when the government is reconstituting itself. Slavery will be ended. The enslavement of human beings will be ended. And this is the moment now when the woman and the Negro, as one of the newspaper editors said, can walk through the door of freedom arm in arm. So we'll gather together to work for universal suffrage. Well, that's not exactly what happened because the radical Republicans, and yes, that's not an oxymoron, radical in the sense that it was used in the 19th century, meaning to the root of the oppression. And the radical Republicans said, we just can't, it's not time for women's rights. It's not time for women's suffrage. We wouldn't be able to get it through Congress. So we'll just go for the rights of the African American man to vote. That way we'll sidestep the whole issue of women. So the sidestepping didn't exactly happen because while the 15th Amendment abolished slavery and enslavement in the United States, the 14th Amendment was sort of the enabling, the description of how this would be implemented. And they had to define citizens at that point because the Constitution, previous to the end of enslavement with the constitutional amendment, it had to be a constitutional amendment because the original Constitution called slaves three-fifths of a person for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. And it also, the Constitution called for the return of um, fugitive slaves, if you will. We call them freedom takers. But so the 14th Amendment had to define citizens, and the 14th Amendment defined citizens as male three times in the 14th Amendment. Male citizen, male citizen, male citizen. It put gender into the Constitution for the very first time. Up until that point, it was not a question of who was a citizen. The assumption could be that women are citizens as well. but with the 14th Amendment, that fell out. So there was a lot of conflict in this moment, and the conflict was not, interestingly, black and white. It wasn't man and woman. I think it was Charles Purvis, no, it was Robert Purvis, his father, who said, I have a son and a daughter. I would rather that my son wait for 50 years to get the vote than that my daughter wait for 1 minute. Because as a woman, as a Negro, she is doubly in need of the protection of the ballot. He did not support the 14th Amendment. His son Charles, on the other hand, did. These were abolitionists of African American family that were well known in the abolition movement. But it did split apart the abolition movement and the women's rights movement, and women had to choose, and men did, which side they would be on. Well, the women that I'm going to be talking about tonight, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and the lesser known, but perhaps more important, Matilda Joslyn Gage, formed the National Woman Suffrage Association, going for a national federal amendment to the Constitution. The American Women's Suffrage Association was more conservative, and their plan was to work state by state. Well, that's a little iffy if you think about it, because this is at a moment when, after the Civil War and after the 14th and 15th Amendments, the South really tried to reinstitute their power. And one of the ways they did it was with all the Jim Crow laws, grandfather clause. If your grandfather hadn't voted, um, you have to be able to read and write. And of course, it was illegal for enslaved people to learn to read and write, for anyone to teach them to. So it was, if you say, well, state by state, give women the right to vote, doesn't that empower the state to define who can vote? It was kind of up for grabs. Is it the feds or is it the states that define that? So the national said no, it has to be at the federal level. That's who should define citizenship, and that's who should define who can vote, because we know what the South's going to do. So you have these two organizations, and they begin to work in very different ways. Let me give you an example. The National Women's Suffrage Association, in at the anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, launched a tax protest campaign. And they said, as did the founding fathers, no taxation without representation. And so they refused to pay their taxes. Um, 1876, it gets even more, I think, confrontational. Gage was president of the National that year, and she introduced a series of resolutions that were passed. One of them said, the women of 1876 had more cause for discontent, rebellion, and revolution than did the fathers in 1776. Men in 1776 were ruled by a foreign despot. We're ruled by our brothers, our fathers, our husbands, and even our sons. They had local home rule in 1776. We have absolutely no say in the government that rules us. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Joslyn Gage set to work to write a woman's Declaration of Rights. And it really, you can compare it with the Declaration of Sentiments that was issued in the 1848, the initial local convention in Seneca Falls, which sort of lays out, this is what we're going to do. By 1876, they know what they're going to do, and they're just demanding. And I think the final statement is, we demand the rights of the absolute rights that that men have. And we demand this for our daughters for forever and ever. It was looking forward to the future. And when Matilda Joslyn Gage wrote up the description in the History of Women's Suffrage that was edited by Stanton, Anthony, and Gage, Matilda Joslyn Gage wrote, 5 women of the National Woman Suffrage Association determined whatever the mandate to present our declaration at the chosen hour. Now, what was the mandate and what was the challenge that they faced? Well, after Stanton and Gage had written the Declaration of Rights of Women, they asked permission to present it at the July 4th celebration, at the official centennial celebration in July 4th, 1876. They were denied. They went all the way up to the Vice President of the United States, and they were told they could not present it. Well, they faced a decision. Would they go ahead and present it and do it illegally, or would they just bow to what the government had said? You can't do it. Well, I think you know what they would do. Maybe it's something we all might think about doing. Gage wrote, 5 women determined whatever the mandate to present the declaration of the chosen at the chosen hour. They faced prison, there they faced arrest, they knew that. She said, we did it not for the women of today, but for the daughters of 1976, so they would know that their mothers of 1876 had impeached the government for its treatment of women. They did it for us, and they knew they were doing it for us. So it was the result of it was, well, first, let me just explain how they did it. Gage was a journalist, so she got tickets in the press section, and they had printed copies of the Declaration of Rights of Women, and they also had put it on like a 6-foot scroll and tied it with red, white, and blue ribbons, rolled it up and tied it. And Gage was holding it close to her chest as and Anthony made their way toward the speaker platform. And nobody understood they were coming or what was going on because it's so unexpected. It's a good action when you're not anticipated. And so there was no arrest. Gage handed the scroll to Susan B. Anthony when they faced the vice president who was actually presiding that day. And Anthony placed it in Vice President's hand and said, Mr. President, we present this on behalf of the women citizens of the United States. And then they left quickly. But the other 3 women that had been with them went through the crowd and scattered the printed copies of the Declaration of Women. And so it became really the talk of the official celebration. And the New York Times had every time that a man, I think, sneezed, but they printed nothing about the presentation of the Declaration. But other newspapers printed the full copy, the full text of the Declaration, and predicted that this would become the thing that would be remembered from the centennial in 1876. But unfortunately, as we know, some of the best stories and the most empowering and important ones from our history get written out. And so this one has gotten largely written out. Well, did they continue on? Yes, in 1886, there's a wonderful uh, picture of the photograph of the unveiling or the declaration, I'm sorry, the Statue of Liberty that was unveiled in New York Harbor in 1886. And Alice Austen took a magnificent photo of it, which you see in the exhibit. Um, what did they say? Look, it's the greatest hypocrisy of the 19th century that woman is representing liberty in a country in which women do not have political liberty. So they hired a boat and they joined there was an aquatic parade that circled Bedloe Island. It's not called Ellis Island. Um, as the statue was unveiled, and they had banners waving votes for women. And once again, they were challenging the government for its treatment of women with direct action. And that really was the name of the game for the National Woman Suffrage Association. Well, in the meantime, other women were doing things that were affiliated with the women's movement. For example, in 1884 and again in 1888, a woman named Belva Lockwood, ran for president of the United States. She was actually the first woman to carry out a campaign, and she got the entire the electors in Indiana, and she actually got some popular vote as well. She demanded that she be recognized for having been a candidate that did get at least one state uh, the electors from one state, but she got written out of history. The Equal Rights Party that she ran on had a really amazingly progressive platform. I'll just give you one example of it. War is a barbarism of the past. Belva Lockwood was a member of the Universal Peace Movement, and their vision was that they would get all the nations of the earth to agree to mandatory binding arbitration of any dispute, and war would be ended. It would not be an option. If two countries had a disagreement, they would automatically have to go into arbitration and find a resolution. And their vision was that that could be accomplished by 1900. They did not envision two world wars to follow. But I think that was it was not just a vision of a few women. It was an entire movement that demanded that war be ended. And it was, women were really instrumental in it. Belva Lockwood also, through the National Woman Suffrage Association support, became the first woman to practice before the Supreme Court. And she, in turn, introduced the first African American man to appear before the Supreme Court. Uh, she also uh, was the lead attorney in getting a large award, the largest award that had been given to any Native nation, to the Cherokee, for the removal of the Trail of Tears. So she's a very interesting woman. And again, we typically don't know a lot about her, but she wasn't the first woman to announce her candidacy for president. The first woman was Victoria Woodhull, and that was in 1872. And she actually announced her candidacy on the Equal Rights Party ticket, and she chose um, Frederick Douglass as her running mate. It's never clear that Douglass agreed to, because the campaign didn't go anywhere. Victoria Woodhull spent election night 1872 in jail. And what was her crime? She and her sister, Tennessee Claflin, had a newspaper. And in their newspaper, they had exposed what we would call today Me Too, two incidents of Me Too. Um, one of them was the most famous minister in America, uh, Beecher, Henry Beecher, who, with the power differential, what we understand today is that ministers, professors, politicians, if they are in an unequal power relationship with a woman, consent is not um, consent is not possible, really, because to have full consent to any kind of sexual behavior, you have to have a level playing field. You have to have an equality where there's no pressure, there's no way in which you can demand and enforce. And in fact, Henry Ward Beecher was the minister of a church who was coercing some of the female parishioners into sexual relations, including a woman, interestingly, who was the vice president of the uh, National Woman Suffrage Association. Henry Ward Beecher was the president of the opposing American Woman Suffrage Association. Remember that group I mentioned way at the beginning? They became more and more conservative. They, in 1876, for example, when the women of the National Woman Suffrage Association were impeaching the government for its treatment of women and risking arrest, the women of the American Woman Suffrage Association held a tea party to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the country. So, Henry Ward Beecher sexually violates the vice president of the National Woman Suffrage Association, while he is president of the American Woman Suffrage Association. You can't make this stuff up. You know, sometimes history is better than the worst made up story, I think. So so the kicker really is that the National Woman Suffrage Association was being attacked by the American Woman Suffrage Association for being a bunch of free lovers because Victoria Woodhull said, I have the absolute right to love anyone I choose for as long as I choose. Um, and uh, Free love was the term they gave to it. And Victoria Woodhull, uh, she clearly was what they were accusing her of. I think Elizabeth Cady Stanton had the best line about she was, accused of being a free lover as well because she supported Woodhull among other things, and she called for women who were being violated by their husbands, being beaten, and whose lives were being threatened. She called for divorce at a time when the religious sanction was so strong that marriage was not an agreement between people, it was a covenant with God, and it couldn't be broken. So she's called a free lover, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton says, well, if by a free lover you mean someone who believes that a woman has the absolute right to her body, she has the right to choose to birth or not, depending upon her judgment, her conscience, and her ability. So Victoria Woodhull is arrested under the Comstock Acts, and I want to just take a few minutes to fill you in on the most evil character of the 19th century, I believe, and someone who we still need to know about today, but I don't think he's very much in people's minds. Anthony Comstock was a one-man Christian nationalist, and he was able to get Congress in a late night session. Half of Congress were drunk, according to the reports at the time, and they passed this legislation that gave Anthony Comstock the right to determine what was obscene in the United States of America. And Comstock decided that anything related to sex, and that included abortion and birth control. Anything related to sex was obscene, and he had the right to arrest and send people to prison. There were thousands of people that were arrested or harassed. There was a woman in my women's suffrage movement anthology. I have the night she wrote, the last night of her life. She had been arrested under the Comstock Acts for a birth control manual that she had written, published, and the judge had said he was going to throw the book at her. Comstock threatened that once she got out of prison for that arrest, he would rearrest her for another book that she had done on women's right to control their bodies. She committed suicide. She killed herself the night before she was to appear before the judge. And she said, I would rather end my life now than to end it in prison. She was 50 years old. And she ends her life and her suicide note with a call for people to fight and continue to fight for reproductive justice. The position that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Joslyn Gage took was this, that every child born had the sacred right to life. And that sacred right to life was the right to be wanted and chosen and welcome into the world. And that was the most sacred right a child had, was to be wanted, was to be chosen. And they said, how can you ensure that? And the only way you can is if a woman is the one to choose, they said. Um, so Anthony Comstock, when Roe v. Wade, well, it really began with um, the first uh, Supreme Court decision in 1965, I think it was Griswold versus the state of Connecticut. And it determined that married couples had the right to use birth control. And that overturned the Comstock Acts partly. And then another Supreme Court decision said that unmarried people had the right to use birth control as well. And so that portion of the Comstock Act was overthrown, was overturned. With Roe v. Wade, the abortion section of the Comstock Act was thrown out, no longer operative. But here's the kicker. With Roe v. Wade being overturned by the Supreme Court, the Comstock Act, in terms of abortion, still remains on the books. And the Supreme Court will be deciding, I think this year, I don't know exactly where the case is right now, but they overturned one challenge to the abortion pill and anything to do with abortion. They overturned it because it had the ones who brought it really didn't have a stake in the decision. So they sort of left it open. Well, bring it on. Give us a case where the people that are bringing the case have will be affected or are affected by it. So we may see an end to abortion in any way in the United States because if the Supreme Court upholds that portion of the Comstock Act that still remains on the books, the abortion pill will be illegal. Also, it's possible that anything related to abortion will be any equipment used, any of the things that are required to do medical abortions will be illegal because the Comstock Act portion of it that remains says that anything related to abortion that's sent through the mails, anything that's obscene, anything that's related to abortion that's sent through the mails cannot be it can't be legal, it can't be used. Well, everything that's used in a medical abortion is, it comes through the mail or it comes through some form of delivery. And the potential to overturn any form of abortion, any even states that where it's legal, um, could happen to us this year. And I think there's a shocking lack of information about it. So, am I going to end it on that note? Um, I think that the process of history that we're experiencing right now is double-edged. We're bringing forth the stories that have been suppressed, and they're just tumbling over each other. We're relearning who we are in magnificent ways. At the same time that, as you know, there is the Christian fundamentalists, the Christian nationalists who are attempting to stop any information that in any way um, tells a story that is distasteful to them, that isn't a rah rah, the US and exceptionalism is the reality. Um, so, we're in a moment now when history is a major battleground to be fought, because if we don't know who we are, we don't know where we're going. And I'm just happy to have the occasion to share some of this information with you. And thank you, Victoria, for allowing me to do this.
Thank you so much. And I think, the way you rounded out that talk, and um, there's obviously so much more that could be covered, would be placing us exactly where so many of us probably have questions for you. And, as I said at the beginning of the talk, I'm originally from New Zealand. I have been in this country for, oh gosh, 27 years now. And I only just became a citizen last year. And so I got to vote for my first time this year, uh,
Mm.
which was an emotional uh, time. Everyone at the polling station cheered and whooped for me.
Ah,
And it was a really, really lovely morning, which turned into a different sort of scenario as the day unfolded, I guess, depending on where you are at. But you know, New Zealand was the first self-governing country to give women the vote.
Yes.
So it is a history that's very dear to my heart, and coming from a very progressive nation that started to be much less progressive under its current government, and what we've actually seen there is the inequities that have always existed become so much greater in such a rapid time frame. Um, from where we were actually making real progress. Um, and so I have a bunch of questions, and I think, but first I'd like to ask one of our questions from the audience before I get into mine. Um, and this is something you may or may not want to approach, but I feel like you have such probably some sage advice. What advice do you have for women today to fight for our freedom over our bodies and whom to love? Because, and they also
Mm.
said we're being controlled and held down.
Yeah, I have a picture that I really value, even though it's not taken by Alice Austen. It was my daughter and I in 1970, and we were in front of the steps of the state capitol in California, and there was an abortion law. This was before Roe v. Wade, 3 years before, but there was an abortion law that was being considered, and we were we were demanding a more cohesive and stronger um, abortion law. And so we're in black. We have we were carrying coat hangers that we dipped in red paint. One of the ways that women did illegal abortions was using coat hangers. Women died, of course. Um, and so that's 1970. And I've been fighting this fight since 1970. Do I have advice? Gotta keep fighting. Gotta keep fighting. And the reality is we're in the majority now. We weren't when Roe v. Wade was decided. We've got a much stronger case right now and a much stronger base from which to fight. And I think it's hard to remember that when we're living with the reality of, a repression that is terrifying for LGBTQ folks, for trans folks. you know, we have to have the backs of those who are um, most endangered right now. And I think we have to just absolutely figure out every single way we can to resist. Um, I think, things are happening. The ERA organizations that are really trying to get Biden to, before the end of his term, to just simply order that the ERA be placed into the Constitution because it's gotten the required number of states. The only question is, the Congress did um, an arbitrary time limit on it, which it doesn't do with any of the other constitutional amendments. But the president has the authority to just say, place this um, you know in the record. This is a part of the Constitution, and it will be part of the Constitution. So the ERA supporters um, did a wonderful exhibit. They got a great big banner, and they placed it. I think it was a federal building, and it was Biden. Do the right thing. It placed the ERA in the Constitution, and it was totally illegal. And some of them were arrested, and it was like they're doing what the National Women's Suffrage Association women did. So I think, that's not the only action that we need to take, but I think being prepared to really find the strongest ways of resisting. The Women's March this weekend all over the country, um, there's ways to resist.
It certainly is a call to action. I think a lot of people felt that the wind was taken out of their sails and they're kind of playing a waiting game, and you can't really afford to wait, because I've certainly seen running an institution that teaches LGBTQ history and has LGBTQ programs. I've seen some cuts to funding around that. And we're just working incredibly hard to continue those programs no matter what. Funding or no funding, we will not turn back the page. We have a dark institutional history, and we have corrected so many wrongs. And sit at the forefront of LGBTQ interpretation at historic sites, and that's not going to change for us.
Good for you.
Yeah, I have
That's
another.
admirable.
Um,
And people should be supporting you. Yes,
yes, I think, yeah, people need to understand that for a lot of institutions that are fighting for our rights, they have had quite severe funding cuts and are worried about how they will continue, although they do
yes,
continue. So it's never just a given, right?
no,
This is our we've been having wake up calls for a long time, but this is a major wake up call that we can't just sit on our laurels.
yeah.
Um, uh, Another question is this, and you partially answered it, but I still want to ask it because they asked, can we use any of the tactics that the suffragettes used for our current battles?
Oh, I think, one of, uh, I think about two of the things that I mentioned that, what would a tax protest look like? What if all the women of the country refuse to pay taxes? Um, we actually still don't have 50% representation, so taxation without representation is still tyranny. And, uh, you know, that's one, people did it during the Vietnam War, opposed the war by refusing to pay taxes. Um, the direct action of the 1876, in your face, facing down the president, the vice president who was presiding, and knowing that you would probably be arrested, but doing it anyway. And our work is for the daughters of what is it? Um, they did it for us, we do it for the daughters that are coming after us. And I my family is three generations of women that are fighting for our rights. And that's a strong, solid foundation when um, you think about who's in the struggle with you. And I think that's part of what can give us courage and strength. But I think, Victoria, I want to get back to what you're doing. This is the moment not to back down. This is the moment to move forward with greater courage, and you're doing it. And I highly commend and respect what you're doing. Thank you for doing it.
Well, thank you. Something that keeps me quite positive is, looking at the swings of the pendulum of history is sometimes when we swing so far conservative, it enables a pathway to swing much further forward. So if this is the pathway, it will endure it, and we'll make sure that we guide that pendulum back to the right place and further forward than where we have already come. Um,
And there
there
were
was
flaws, for example, with Roe
yes,
v. Wade. Uh, it was a woman and her doctor made the decision. Well, we as radical feminists in the 1970s were demanding free abortion upon demand and no, totally a woman's decision. And I think we're in a position where uh, our resistance to the backlash, our backlash, um, we're in a position where we can start demanding even more. Uh, and I think you're right. We're going to swing that pendulum the other way with great strength.
Exactly. There's one more question in the chat, if you can address it briefly. We're nearly out of time, and it's just it's a question of whether the fundamentalist Christian norms surrounding female subjugation, family values, etc., um, are as strong during the suffragist movement as now. I think it's
Hmm.
very but similar in
Matilda Joslyn Gage and Elizabeth Cady Stanton said that the force that is the major force maintaining the oppression of women is Christian, what we would call today Christian nationalism. And the pressure was tremendous. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton published her Woman's Bible, um, she was the president of the what happened in 1890 was that the two organizations merged, but they didn't merge. They really became the Conservative American Woman Suffrage Association. And she became the first president. And and when she published the Woman's Bible in 1895 and then 1898, the National American Woman Suffrage Association basically denounced her and the work. And Matilda Joslyn Gage got really written out of history because of her fighting Christian nationalism. She formed an organization when she dropped out of the movement when it became more conservative after 1890. She formed an organization to fight for a separation of church and state. Uh, so, yes, they were fighting this tooth and nail. Um, and that's another place where we can learn. She brought
yes, it was
together all the progressive people in the country.
well, I just, I really want to thank you so much for your time. And I know that that was a lot of talking and presenting, but you're so adept at all of that. And, I'd love to invite you back to talk a little more about some of your books and some of these other words like intersectionality and things that I think that our audience would be so interested in. Um, and
Well, and there's outing all of the lesbians in the suffrage movement.
exactly,
Oh,
exactly,
they're thick as thieves.
exactly, and so
Yeah.
important. I know Alice wasn't particularly known for necessarily being a part of this movement, although I feel that all of the things that she did really contribute to it. But she certainly photographed very close friends who were very, very involved in the movement who were lesbians and had very strong ties to universities and even now have halls named after them. So, you know, I think it's an incredibly exciting history that isn't necessarily as well known, obviously, as it needs
Yes.
to be. And the one last thing I would love to say is that, you know, these kind of talks and exhibitions that don't, you know, necessarily root ourselves on either side, but um, it's so important to begin to understand some of the history of the parties, the history of even the culture of the names. When you talk about radical Republicans, what that might have meant. in the 1870s, as opposed to what we might think of when we hear the word radical Republican right now. Um, there's so much understanding that's not taught in schools, and I'm glad to see it's beginning to be taught a little more, and just helping to promote that, because understanding is key to moving forward, and knowledge is power. So I thank you so much, Dr. Wagner. And we will be publishing this talk on our website, so you'll be able to access it. Yes, and carry on.
Thank you so much. And I would love to come and visit you at some point. You're doing
Most
great work. And thank you for doing it. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Everyone have a wonderful evening and take care.